and thank you for joining us today. I have the privilege of being here with my friend, Chris Cavoli. We've known each other for around 40 years, which says a little bit about our age. And I have had the privilege of seeing Chris' career throughout the military, most recently as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, effectively the military head of NATO. And before that, as a theater commander, as the head of the United States Army Europe and a divisional commander. And Chris has been at the forefront of many of the issues that we are discussing these days, and is a very close confidant of many of the leaders in the world that right now are making important decisions around the future of our security and geopolitics. So it's a pleasure to be with Chris here today, and thank you, Chris, for coming. And I thought we'd start by just talking about the health of NATO. How is NATO doing, particularly after you spend time at the Munich conference?
Thanks, yeah. Hey, Juan, it's great to be here. Yeah, so NATO was very invigorated and sort of rejuvenated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It was a massive wake-up call. You know, if you think about the arc of what happened in the alliance's history since it was formed in 1949, we had the Cold War, during which we had a pretty defined mission of collective defense, like large-scale territorial operations. Then after the Cold War, that was no longer necessary. So NATO focused on out-of-area operations, which were kind of smaller operations done on a very predictable, cyclical basis. And the alliance optimized for that. Everybody reduced the size of their armed forces, et cetera. And that's kind of the alliance that we've always been impatient with, right? Slow to act because political considerations were paramount. Smaller militaries, less capable of a large-scale operations. But the war in Ukraine really changed that very, very quickly. And in 2022, the heads of state and government of NATO gave SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander, the instructions to create a strategy and implement a strategy to defend the territory of the alliance again, to return to that collective defense as the primary mission set. I took command 5 days after those orders were given. So my tenure for 3 years consisted of developing the plans and the force structure requirements, essentially the shopping list, to rebuild the alliance's military structures. And all of that was approved over the last 3 years. There's a huge sense of urgency, but there are many obstacles that remain. Mostly among them, the capacity of our industrial base to produce the quantities of equipment we need in the time frame necessary.
But before we go to the industrial base, because that's going to be an important topic, what lessons do you see from Ukraine? Because as you're looking at force structure and you're looking at emerging threats, and then you have now a very different type of weapon on the battlefield than perhaps was envisioned 20, 30 years ago. How do you see that navigating?
Yeah, so I mean, the lessons of the war in Ukraine are many, but to pick a couple of the big sort of meta themes of the war that we have to respond to, the first is scale. We just haven't seen a war of this scale in years. It's massive. The Russians have lost about 4,000 tanks, for example. And by way of reference point, France has about 200 tanks. The UK has about 200. They're building down to 148. Germany has about 300. Russia has lost 4,000 tanks and has replaced them. So the size of this war is just out of proportion to what we have been thinking about in the past. The implications for us is that the depth of our stockpiles is not as significant as it should be. And in fact, whether it's during the defense of Israel in April and June of last year, whether it's our ability to supply the Ukrainians with specialized munitions like anti-ballistic missiles, we have discovered that we require a lot more quantities than we had been planning for or than we really wanted to buy during the 30 years of out-of-area operations. And we're working on that now. We're applying the money across the alliance. We've got the checkbooks out, but now the problem is there's not much in the store to buy. And producing these things is quite difficult. You know, when we had the luxury of fighting or operating against adversaries that were not really a peer level with us, then we had the luxury of designing weapons that sort of that were ideal, and we chose to develop, largely because of people like me, we chose to develop really exquisite weapon systems that are absolutely fantastic, incredibly capable, very difficult to build, therefore very expensive, therefore we don't have many in our inventories, and because they're difficult to build, they're hard to scale when you need them. So we've got to, you know, sort of reverse that design philosophy. That's the first big lesson you get out of Ukraine, and it has implications across the alliance, across the United States, and I think it's going to drive a lot of where we see things go in the future.
So as you talk about this, and you think about the military-industrial complex and the incumbent large providers and the emerging companies, the question then becomes, how do we build the industrial base to actually achieve that? And not just in the United States, but in Europe, because both of these constituencies need the ability to produce these new weapon systems, because it seems it's redesigning and production.
Yeah.
So how do you go about doing that?
Well, so the easy answer would be you just lay down multi-year contracts. Large companies see those contracts, invest as a result in additional production capacity, and build. The problem is it's not only capacity that we need, it's also certain capabilities. What we've seen in the war, a second big lesson from the war in Ukraine, is the rate of military innovation on the battlefield has begun to approximate what we've seen in the consumer and the commercial sectors. So the Silicon Valley type speed of innovation now is a reality on the battlefield in Ukraine. Much credit to the Ukrainian people for innovating so quickly, and to their military for figuring out how to harness that. But harnessing innovation is going to be just as difficult, more difficult probably, than building capacity. So I think the first thing that has to change is the basic approach that we use for most weapon systems. Most weapon systems, the government develops requirements, and those are those exquisite requirements I was describing a moment ago, right? You lay these requirements out, and they're extremely specific. This is exactly what I want this system to do. And then industry responds to that. But they're usually pretty much reach goals. Industry incurs a lot of risk to do that, so industry wants to share the risk with the government, and you end up in the cost-plus contracting system that we've had for years. It didn't come about by accident. It came about because of the way we were doing business with the requirements pulling development. What we're seeing in Ukraine is very much like what we've seen out of the U.S. tech sector when it comes to commercial stuff. We have seen innovation that is generated by companies, by entrepreneurs, and then offered as a solution to a problem somebody may or may not have realized they had. It's more opportunism rather than problem solving in some ways. That being imported into the military acquisition process is going to be very, very important. So I think what we'll end up with is a blend of the large capacity to fulfill requirements that are laid out by the government, as well as an attempt to benefit from and harness the innovation of the commercial sector.
And you think the policy is there to allow that to happen?
Yeah, so this administration is doing an awful lot to foster that. It's complicated business to do it, and like any policy, I'm sure many of the policies will be well-intentioned and have unexpected effects, and vice versa. But yes, I think the policies are moving in that direction. There are some things that are just going to be in tension and are going to be difficult to solve. One of them is this question of stockpiles, right? So one would hate to develop, for instance, a huge stockpile of drones in anticipation of a war that may come in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, because it's very likely, based on the rate of innovation we see in Ukraine, that those drones will be outdated by the time the war comes. So, how do you build inventory without building obsolescence into your stockpile is one question that we're going to have to face. So some of those tensions aren't really going to be solvable by policy necessarily, but most of the other ones I think will be. There's a huge desire in government in the US right now, as well as in our allies, to attract private capital because it tends to move in a more agile fashion along with entrepreneurs to be able to drive this innovation forward until it gets to a point where the government captures certain products.
Before we go to that, the European side.
Yeah.
You've heard President Macron and others talk about the integration of the European production and military. Do you think the Europeans can respond, as I think you're suggesting we are responding on this side of the Atlantic?
Yeah, so historically, the challenge for the defense industry in Europe is that it operates on the basis of national champions, right? Just like in any country, just like in our country, defense industry produces jobs, it produces steady revenue streams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a political imperative to keep that production inside your own country. In the case of Europe, what that does is fragment what could be a large unified defense market into 27 different smaller markets. Hard to achieve like a total addressable market that attracts large capital investments. It's hard to gain economies of scale. There have been examples like the Airbus consortium that have very successfully operated transnationally and have been able to break that paradigm. But it is sort of the holy grail of European defense industry to be able to achieve some sort of unified market that overcomes those national tensions. There's a lot of movement toward that right now. I think the problem is better recognized, and there is more unanimity behind solving this now than I've seen in the past. But it's still going to take some political spade work to get out there and persuade folks that that's no longer the model to follow. There are things that we can do to help that, and I do think that the U.S. administrations over the last couple have been working hard in that regard.
And you mentioned capital.
Yeah.
Ultimately, capital is necessary. And there's two ways to look at it. There's the government capital coming in and promoting programs, whether in the US or Europe, and there's the private capital coming in, and in the middle of this, there's a whole risk-reward equation, right? As companies, you mentioned companies coming in and anticipating what needs may be and going forward, as opposed to responding to the needs articulated by the government.
Yeah.
How do you see that capital dynamic playing out?
Well, the basic question comes down to risk, as you pointed out in the process of asking the question. If we move toward a paradigm where entrepreneurs come up with solutions and offer them to the government when they weren't necessarily asked for, or when they were only asked for in the broadest sense, not in line-by-line specification, then those entrepreneurs are taking risk, right? They're taking a greater risk than the cost-plus risk left with the traditional prime system. And that risk has to be absorbed by somebody, and that's where private capital comes in. So it's an essential part of driving that method into the future. In Europe, it's going to be challenging because, as many folks in the audience are very familiar, Europe's capital markets, especially the private capital markets, are not very fluid, not very well developed. The Capital Markets Union, which is another EU thing that is sort of just sort of spun around in the wash cycle forever and has never come into being. That's being talked about a lot more now. When I talk to European entrepreneurs, great technology, great engineers, in some locations, plenty of venture money. Where they really run into problems is growth stage capital, right? Where you need a pretty big check to be able to start scaling. all of a sudden that's really not available readily to them in Europe. So that is going to hinder them from developing the sort of innovation approach or fulfilling the innovation requirement in their defense industry as we go forward if they can't solve that in the near future, if somebody can't step in with that.
Which makes sense. So if you have the capital and people are looking at growth stage, when I think of growth stage, I'm also thinking reindustrialization.
Yeah.
So how do you see that narrative playing out as we look at productive capacity, manufacturing capacity in the US and in Europe to meet these new evolving requirements?
Yeah, so the reindustrialization project, I think, is intimately related to the topic of rearmament. Not necessarily in terms of the innovation, but definitely in terms of the capacity. It starts with securing supply chains. I think I'm not plowing new ground by bringing that up right now. There's certainly a lot of attention being paid to it. Again, I'm gratified that the U.S. government is finding ways to favor that. I think we can quibble with some of the exact decisions being made, but the general impetus to make sure that we get a combination of government and private industry to secure our supply chains and develop indigenous or friend-shored supply chains is absolutely critical. You know, then the next step is building the manufacturing capacity, building the fabrications and everything. A lot of new work being done, very exciting work being done by advanced manufacturing companies that focus on advanced manufacturing but are agnostic of what they're necessarily going to build there. It's the method of building that they're focused on. I think there's a lot of promise in that. The one thing I think that bears more attention right now is the skilled workforce. A large amount of this is going to be able to be satisfied by automation. I think we can look at a generation skip in terms of our manufacturing technologies, but in the end, there are going to be certain skill sets that are going to be highly skilled, people-driven labor, and we need to invest in that. And the problem with that is you can't invest in it today and have it tomorrow. It's a long-term commitment to developing those skills. So I think we'll see more of that developing in the future as well.
And as you look at the deployment of capital now, the reindustrialization, the challenges, and you think of the force structures that you're going to see in the United States and Europe in 10 and 15 years, what do you think those force structures are? And how do you see them expressing themselves perhaps differently in both continents?
Sure, yeah. So first of all, there's a great deal of enthusiasm for some of the leading edge technologies that we see in the Ukraine war, and justifiably so. There's some really, there's some very interesting, very capable stuff being done. However, if you look historically, most militaries, no military is completely modernized, right? I mean, if you think about the famous Blitzkrieg of Germany across France, 1940, only the leading edge of that army was in tanks and using radios and all the things that we think of as the modern, the revolution in warfare that they brought. The vast majority of the Wehrmacht was on horses and wagons and walking on foot. I think we can see that going into the future. And in fact, we see it in Ukraine. Most of the destruction being done is being done by old-fashioned systems such as cannon artillery and tanks and things like that. It's only in the last year and a half that drones have come up higher on the list of destructive items, and that's really because of a paucity of artillery shells. So I guess where I'm going is the legacy equipment that makes up the bulk of countries' fleets is going to continue to exist and is going to continue to be useful. And there's going to be sort of, an obsolescent part of an army, then the great middle part of the army that uses current technologies and legacy equipment, and then there's going to be a leading edge that's modernized fully. I think the advantage is going to accrue to the country that's able to use the modernization and technology to amplify the effects of the legacy systems and the legacy organizations, and then is able to modify that interaction according to the conditions on the battlefield so that it can stay ahead of an action, reaction, counteraction cycle like we see in Ukraine, that rapid innovation cycle. So I think what we'll see in force structure in the future is a combination of the things that are already so familiar, tanks and big ships. They're not going to just disappear, but we're going to have a different interaction between those things and leading edge technologies than we've seen in the past. It's not necessarily going to be built into the principal systems. It's going to be the way they interact with the leading edge technologies.
So as a final question, given time, it does bring it together, because what you're suggesting, and I appreciate the continuity you're articulating, is that the entire manufacturing, production, military establishment ecosystem needs to work. The new ones, the new companies with the innovation driving forward, the established military-industrial complex, optimizing what exists in order to make it be more effective and last longer, in order to be able to project power in an effective way. So small companies, new companies, established players all will need to work together.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I do think that's possible. First of all, it's possible because it's necessary, and when things are necessary, they have a greater likelihood of becoming coming into being, right? Necessity as the mother of invention. But I do think it's a great opportunity, right? Antonio frequently points out that a lot of existing manufacturers, no matter what the sector, have excess capacity that's sort of locked up and inaccessible. But if you can get it, and if you can find a new way to access it, you suddenly open a huge amount of capacity for yourself. I think we're going to find things like that going forward in defense. I think it's going to happen when we get the proper or the positive and constructive level of interaction between entrepreneurs with their innovation and their speed, and the capacity and intrinsic capabilities of the large companies that have been doing this for decades. How we foster that is going to be an important part of things. I think government can foster it to a certain degree, but I think, again, private capital can convene those two sort of leagues and bring them together and help to foster positive interaction between them that will serve us better than the sum of the parts.
So I guess one last question, I promise, which is private capital. So we've been in this industry for a long time, and I remember when private capital was very reluctant to participate in anything that was related to weapons and kinetic force.
Yeah.
That's changed. Is it changing in Europe, and is it changing in the US fast enough?
Yeah, it is changing in Europe because of necessity again. You know, I had one colleague who was a prime minister for a long time, and he would kind of laugh at me and say, you know, or laugh with me and say, Chris, you know, when I was the prime minister, we were not allowed to invest national funds in drugs, pornography, and defense. You know, now you are no longer equivalent to pornography, Chris. I'm like, thank you very much. I think that evolution we see in pension funds. I think we see it in the relaxation of certain ESG rules. The EU has relaxed some of its standards in that regard. We're starting to see some family offices in Europe reconsider long-standing reluctance to invest in these things. And it all comes down to necessity, right? I mean, this war and the challenge posed by Russia, the threat posed by Russia, is considered by our European colleagues to be an existential threat. And therefore, a lot of things that were off limits during more luxurious times suddenly become necessities. And they are adapting accordingly. Like any adaptation, it takes a while. It's a pretty deep societal transformation that has to take place on both sides of the Atlantic, on that side especially. But I do think we're starting to see it happen. We do see it starting to happen. And it's kind of, you know, similar to the evolution that we saw in Silicon Valley, right? It wasn't that many years ago when at Google there was a large a protest of the workers because they didn't want to be involved in a Pentagon contract that the company had entered into. That's very, very different now, right? Now we have an entire defense tech sphere out there. I think that general evolution is being repeated in Europe right now, to include in the tech sphere, not just the capital sphere.
Hopefully with impact, because there's not much of a choice here right now.
Yeah, there's not, because we simply don't have the capacity to provide what this country needs to replenish our stocks, to rearm our military, to contend with the global threats that we have. We are not a one-problem country. You know, Europe and European security and its implications for global security are not our only problem, right? We also have other parts of the globe that we have to deal with. And so all of that takes capacity to produce the right armaments and the right equipment for. So we don't necessarily have the luxury any longer of being able to be the manufacturer for the world on these things, not on the timelines that are required. So, it's a very positive sign if Europe is able to step up to this.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for the time today, and thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you all.